No one stopped for the dying black horse by the frozen road, until one lonely cowboy pulled over and changed both their lives forever. The wind was cruel that Wyoming morning, slicing across the empty plains. Trucks roared past a dark shape in the snow, their drivers too tired or too cold to care. But when Eli Hart hit the brakes, he didn't know he was about to save more than a horse. He was about to save himself. The Wyoming wind moved like breath across the wide basin, carrying the smell of frozen sage and old dust. Evening light spilled over the prairie in pale ribbons, and a single truck crawled along the gravel road. A farrier's truck, its paint faded by years of sun. Behind the wheel, Eli Hart kept his eyes on the horizon, hands rough from iron and fire. The road was long and silent, the kind of silence that made a man feel smaller than the land itself. Then, in the ditch beside the half-frozen creek, he saw it. Something dark, motionless. At first, he thought it was a fallen log, maybe a tarp torn loose from a hay truck. But as his headlights cut across it, the shape breathed, the faintest rise and fall. A horse. Eli slowed, the engine rumbling low. The animal lay on its side, ribs like fence slats beneath dull black hair. Frost gathered at its nostrils. No movement beyond that. Someone had left it here to die. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching over the hard ground. The air stung his throat, sharp with cold, and the scent of iron from his own tools. The world around him was empty. No sound but the wind moving through sage and a distant coyote's cry. Eli knelt beside the horse, unsure why. His fingers hovered above the creature's neck, then stopped short. Its skin twitched faintly under the thin coat, a pulse weak as the memory of music. For a moment, the farrier saw not the dying horse, but a flash of another day, a rodeo arena, a bucking bronc, the crack of bone, a life that used to be. He swallowed hard and pushed the memory down. "Easy," he muttered, though he didn't expect a response. The horse's eyes were cloudy, yet in that dull haze, something flickered. A quiet plea, the kind that doesn't need words. Eli exhaled slowly. A truck passed behind him, throwing up dust and diesel smoke. The driver didn't stop. The wind carried the sound away, leaving only stillness again. Eli pulled off his worn sheepskin jacket and laid it over the horse's body. The fabric looked too small against the weight of the animal, but the act felt right, like setting a hand over a wound. He stood there for a while, watching the breath of the horse fade into the cold air. "You've been out here a while," he said quietly. "So have I." When he finally turned back toward his truck, the animal gave a faint sound, a rasping sigh that might have been a breath or a whisper. Eli stopped mid-step. His heart thudded once, heavy and low. He looked at the dying creature, and then at the open road stretching ahead into nothing but blue-gray dusk. Something inside him refused to keep driving. He walked back to the horse and crouched once more. The air bit into his hands. He checked the worn halter still around its head, the cracked leather stiff with mud. "You're not done yet," he said under his breath. "Neither am I." Eli went to his truck, found the old horse blanket he kept from his rodeo days, and spread it over the frail body. He didn't think about what came next, whether it would live, whether he could even lift it. He just did what his hands knew. Tied a rope, made a plan without words. By the time the moon rose, he had the animal standing, barely, its front legs trembling under its own weight. With patience and the strength of habit, Eli guided it up the ramp into the truck bed. The boards creaked beneath every step, and when the horse finally lay down again, its breath came shallow but steady. He tightened the rope loosely, not to bind, just to promise. "You're not being left behind again." The farrier climbed behind the wheel, started the truck, and drove toward the faint outline of the mountains. The headlights washed across the road, over the sage and snow patches, over fences leaning tiredly against the wind. In the rearview mirror, he saw the shape of the horse, black against black, breathing in rhythm with the hum of the engine. Something inside him shifted, small but certain. Eli didn't know why he'd stopped that night. Maybe mercy, maybe guilt, maybe both. All he knew was that for the first time in years, he wasn't driving away from something. He was driving toward it. The road ahead shimmered with frost under the moonlight, endless and quiet, and behind him, in the dark of the truck bed, the horse's shallow breath rose and fell, a sound as fragile as hope itself. The truck rolled into the basin just before dawn. The horizon was washed in a thin ribbon of silver, the kind of light that doesn't warm anything, but lets you see what's still breathing. Eli stopped beside an old barn that leaned against the wind like an aging man. May Rivers lived there, across the fence line, widow, quiet, used to early calls for help. When she opened her door and saw the farrier standing in the pale light, her eyes dropped to the shape in the truck bed. "Lord, Eli," she whispered, "what have you brought me?" "A horse that ran out of road," he said simply. They worked without talk. May fetched blankets. Eli pulled down the ramp and coaxed the animal onto the frozen dirt. It stumbled once, knees folding like wet rope, but he steadied it with his shoulder. "Easy now," he murmured, the words low, almost private. The horse trembled, breath smoking in short, visible bursts. Inside the old stall, the smell of dust and straw hung heavy. The horse lay down again, too weak to stand. Its coat looked black once, but now it was the color of ashes soaked in rain. Eli fetched a pail of water from the pump, let the ice crust melt between his hands, and offered it. The horse's cracked lips twitched. Drops slid from its muzzle, darkening the straw. Dr. Pike's truck arrived an hour later, grumbling through the cold. The old veterinarian stepped down stiffly, his coat smelling of tobacco and liniment. He pressed along the horse's ribs, fingers tracing scars like stories that should never have been written. "Starved," he muttered. "Worked near to death. You're either saving him or just delaying the inevitable." "I'll take what time there is," Eli said. Dr. Pike gave a short nod. "Then stay through the night. It won't last alone." He left a bottle of ointment and drove off, his taillights fading into the gray. The barn went still again, except for the shallow rhythm of breath. Eli set up his small forge in the corner, the same kit he carried from ranch to ranch. When he struck the hammer against the anvil, a clean metallic note split the silence. Clink. The sound cut through the cold like a heartbeat. The horse lifted its head. Just a few inches, but it looked toward him. Its ears turned, searching the air. Eli froze, hammer raised. Then he struck again. Clink. The animal's nostrils flared, a slow exhale clouding the air between them. "You hear that?" Eli said softly. "That's the sound of work, the sound of staying alive." He worked the metal slowly, not to shoe the horse, but to keep the forge warm. Each strike filled the barn with a faint, steady rhythm, iron on iron, like breath against breath. Outside, wind chased dry snow across the ground. Inside, life whispered itself back in fragments of sound. May returned with a pot of coffee, steam curling from her hands. She stood by the door, watching Eli's reflection flicker in the firelight. "You're staying, then," she said quietly. He nodded. "Till it doesn't need me." She looked at the horse, then at him. "Maybe it's the other way around." Eli didn't answer. The hammer fell again. Clink, and somewhere in that small noise, he heard something like faith. Night settled slow. The forge dimmed, the fire sinking to embers. Eli sat against the stall door, jacket draped over his shoulders. The horse lay breathing, shallow but steady, eyes half open, watching him in return. Every now and then, a shiver ran through its body, and he would speak softly, the way a man does when there's no one left to listen but an animal. "Rest, old boy," he said. "You've done your part." The wind outside eased, and the first stars appeared beyond the broken roof. Eli closed his eyes, listening to the faint ring of cooling iron behind him. The sound lingered long after the fire had gone out. Gentle. Constant, like a memory that refuses to fade. When morning came, frost laced the stall door in patterns fine as lace. The horse was still breathing. Barely. Eli rose, joints stiff, and poured the last of his water into the pail. The creature's muzzle found it again, slower this time, but deliberate. It was enough. From the road, a single truck passed without stopping. Eli didn't look up. He'd stopped caring who didn't slow down. He was listening instead, to the quiet ring of iron in his ears, to the heartbeat of something returning to life, to the sound of work that still had meaning. And as the sun broke through the cold, striking his anvil in one clean beam of light, the farrier thought, maybe this is what mercy sounds like. 3 days passed, the basin swept clean by wind and pale light. The snow crusted in thin layers over the fences, cracking when Eli walked. Inside the barn, it smelled of straw, coal dust, and the slow, stubborn scent of life. The horse was still there, still breathing, thin, uneven, but alive. Its coat, once black, had turned the color of damp ashes. Eli crouched beside it, rubbing a handful of warm liniment between his palms before smoothing it across the animal's neck. The skin twitched beneath his touch, but the horse didn't pull away. "You're still here," he said quietly. "Guess that makes 2 of us." May came in with a thermos of coffee, boots trailing snow. She leaned against the doorframe, watching in silence for a while. "You can't save them all, Eli," she murmured. "Sometimes the kindest thing is to let go." Eli looked at the animal's face, the clouded eye that followed movement even through the haze of exhaustion. "I don't think it's asking for saving," he said. "Just a chance to stand." May smiled faintly and reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a scarf, red wool, worn soft at the edges. "It was my husband's. Maybe it'll help keep it warm." Eli hesitated, then nodded. He wrapped the scarf around the horse's neck, the red cutting through the gray like a streak of fire. "That'll do," he whispered. "Cinder. That's what I'll call you. Still burning under all that ash." The horse's ears twitched at the name, a small sign that didn't escape him. He felt something tighten in his chest, something that hadn't moved in years. Naming was dangerous. It meant belonging. but the word had already found its place. Outside, wind stirred the loose boards on the barn wall. Inside, Eli struck the anvil again, once to test a piece of iron. The tone rang pure and sharp, filling the space like light. This time, Cinder didn't flinch. The rhythm of the sound seemed to steady his breathing. The farrier worked quietly, shaping nothing in particular, just keeping the forge alive. By evening, Cinder managed to rise on his front legs, trembling but determined. Eli set down his tools and stepped closer. "Easy, old boy," he said, one hand out. The horse fought gravity, muscles quivering, and for a heartbeat it stood, shaking, weak, but upright. Eli's breath caught. "There you go," he whispered. "There you go." When the animal sank back down, it was from exhaustion, not surrender. The red scarf brushed the straw, a small flag of defiance in a world too cold to care. Eli sat beside it for a long while, his back against the stall door. The sound of the wind outside blended with the slow rhythm of the horse's breathing. That night, May stopped by again. She handed him a small loaf of bread, still warm from her oven. "You've got that look," she said softly, "like someone who found a reason to stay up nights again." "Work keeps me honest," Eli said, but his voice came out rough. "Work, sure," she replied, glancing toward Cinder. "But maybe it's more than that." Eli didn't argue. He couldn't find the words. Instead, he watched the horse sleep, chest rising with shallow breaths that glowed faintly in the light of the lantern. He could see the marks of old ropes around its neck, scars that spoke of years under harsh hands. He wondered how long it had waited for someone to see it, as more than weight and labor. The forge hissed as he quenched a piece of metal. Steam rose, twisting like ghosts in the lamplight. He thought of the years he'd spent moving from ranch to ranch, fixing hooves, patching fences, staying nowhere long enough to matter. Maybe that's why he stopped on that road, to remind himself that he could still make something whole. Before he left the barn for the night, Eli brushed Cinder's mane gently. "Sleep while you can," he said. "Tomorrow, we try again." The horse's ear flicked in acknowledgement, a whisper of trust. When Eli stepped outside, the sky was a bowl of frozen stars. He tilted his head back, letting the cold bite into him. Behind him, through the gaps in the barn's wood, he saw the glow of the forge and the faint shadow of Cinder lying still, scarf catching the light like an ember refusing to die. The farrier stood there a long while, listening to the wind whistle through the wire fence, feeling the ache in his left wrist, where old bones never healed right. He flexed his hand and whispered to the dark, "We'll get there." And somewhere in that empty Wyoming night, a single sound answered back, a quiet snort from the barn, like agreement. The next morning, Eli found Cinder standing on all fours, wobbling but proud. For the first time, he smiled. The farrier's life had been nothing but moving on, but now he felt anchored to something small, breathing, and stubborn. He looked at the red scarf again, bright against the pale light, and thought, maybe this is what being seen feels like. The thaw never came that week. Wind pressed hard against the basin, bending the wire fences and scattering drifts of snow across the frozen pasture. Eli hammered a loose hinge back onto the barn door, the sound echoing sharp in the cold morning air. Inside, Cinder shifted on his feet, stronger now, still thin, but no longer trembling. When Eli brushed his coat, The dust rose like faint smoke, carrying the scent of straw and ash. The quiet was broken by a low growl of an engine. Eli looked up as a glossy black pickup rolled up the drive, tires grinding the gravel. The truck stopped close enough to spray slush against his boots. The driver's door swung open, and a man stepped down. Boots polished, hat tilted low. Kyle Brigg. Everyone in the county knew him, the man who bought cheap and sold without conscience, a livestock dealer who made his living turning the unwanted into profit. "Well, I'll be damned," Brigg said, eyeing the horse through the open barn door. "Didn't think he'd last this long." Eli wiped his hands on his jeans, his face unreadable. "You left him to die," Brigg smirked. "He wasn't earning his keep. What a man does with his property is his business." He flipped open a folder and waved a folded paper. "Got the bill of sale right here. Horse is mine, farrier. Guess you've been boarding him for free." Cinder flicked an ear at the sound of Brigg's voice, muscles tightening under the skin. Eli stepped slightly closer to him, the movement small but deliberate. "You left him on a public road," he said quietly. "That's not ownership. That's abandonment." Brigg's grin hardened. "You think the law's gonna take your side over mine? Paper don't lie. You can keep playing cowboy hero, but that animal's worth money, and I aim to collect." He glanced around the barn, the forge, the tools. "Funny thing. You can patch up what's broken, but it still belongs to someone else." Eli didn't answer. The only sound was the slow scrape of metal as he set his hammer down on the anvil. The tone of iron against steel rang once, high and sharp, cutting through the tension like a warning bell. Brigg adjusted his hat. "I'll be back in a few days. Brand inspector's coming through town for the auction. We'll see what he says about who owns what." He started to leave, then paused. "You might want to keep your pet in good shape. Makes him worth more when I take him." Eli's jaw tightened. "You won't take him." Brigg chuckled, the sound low and slick. "We'll see." The truck roared to life, spitting gravel as it turned toward the road. Snow whipped behind it, swallowing the sound. Eli stood in the settling silence, his breath clouding. Cinder nudged his shoulder gently, a silent question. He rested a hand on the horse's neck, feeling the steady pulse there. "He's gone," Eli murmured. "For now." That night, the storm returned. The wind moaned through the cracks of the barn, rattling loose boards. Eli stoked the forge again, not for work, but for warmth. Each swing of the hammer steadied his thoughts. The red scarf around Cinder's neck caught the firelight, flickering with each gust. The sight anchored him. May appeared at the doorway, her shawl pulled tight. "I saw Brigg's truck," she said softly. "You should be careful, Eli. Men like him don't back down." "I know what kind he is," Eli replied. "And I know what kind I am." May studied him for a long moment. "You'll fight for that horse?" Eli's gaze drifted toward Cinder. The animal stood steady, head bowed slightly, eyes reflecting the firelight. "He already fought for his life," he said. "I'm just catching up." Outside, thunder rolled, a rare sound in the Wyoming winter. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, carrying the metallic tang of coming snow. Eli stepped to the barn door and watched the sky darken to a shade of bruised purple. "He'll come back," he said. May touched his arm. "Then let him find you ready." When she left, Eli turned down the forge and sat in the quiet. He pulled a small tin from his jacket, horse salve, thick and pungent, and rubbed it along Cinder's scars. "You've known worse men," he said. The horse exhaled softly, leaning into his touch. For a moment, everything else fell away. The road, the threats, the law. There was only warmth, the steady rhythm of care, the kind that builds itself into prayer. When the storm hit full force, Eli lay on a pile of blankets near the stall. Snow rattled against the tin roof like scattered nails. He could feel Cinder shifting restlessly on the other side of the wood slats. "It's all right," Eli murmured. "We've both been claimed before." The horse snorted, a puff of white mist against the dark. The forge embers glowed low, throwing long shadows across the barn wall. One of those shadows looked like two figures standing side by side, the shape of a man and the outline of a horse that refused to disappear. As Eli drifted toward sleep, the thought came unbidden. You can't own what's freely given. He didn't know whether he was thinking about mercy or about the moment on that lonely road when he chose to stop. Maybe both. By morning, the wind had died, leaving a world remade in white. The tracks from Briggs' truck were gone, buried under fresh snow. Only two sets of prints remained. Boots and hooves, side by side, leading to the barn. Eli followed them with his eyes and said quietly, "Guess the only thing that matters is who stays." The first flakes began to fall before sunrise, drifting sideways in the wind like ash shaken from an old fire. By mid-morning, the world had turned white. The basin disappeared beneath a sheet of snow, and the air itself seemed to hum with the sound of distance. Eli stood at the barn door, collar pulled high, watching the wind whip through the cottonwoods. The horizon was gone. Just a blur of gray and movement. May came running across the field, coat unbuttoned, her voice barely cutting through the storm. "Eli, the mares, they're still out in the lower pasture." She was breathless, snow clinging to her hair. "They won't find the way back if the drifts get higher." Eli grabbed his gloves and rope. "How many?" "5. 2 of them close to foaling." He looked toward Cinder, who was shifting nervously in his stall, ears flicking at the rising howl of wind. The red scarf on his neck flared like a live coal against the gray. "You up for this?" Eli asked. The horse blew a sharp breath, stamping once as if to answer. The farrier strapped on his worn saddle, tied a short sleigh behind it, and checked the harness twice. His bad wrist ached from the cold, but he ignored it. When he swung into the saddle, the weight felt heavier than usual. But so did the air. It was the kind of storm that measured a man's resolve. They pushed into the blizzard. Snow slashed their faces, wind twisting through wire fences like a whistle. Eli bent low over the saddle, letting Cinder find his own rhythm. Each step left a shallow print that filled instantly behind them. The sound of hooves was muted, replaced by the steady thud of determination. Halfway down the slope, visibility dropped to nothing. Eli stopped, trying to listen through the wind. Then, faint and distant, he heard it. A weak neigh, thin as a thread of smoke. "You hear that?" he said, leaning forward. Cinder's ears pricked, and he moved toward the sound without hesitation. They found the mares huddled near the frozen creek, snow crusted on their backs. Eyes wide with fear. One of them had fallen, her legs tangled in wire. Eli dismounted, pulling his gloves off to free her, fingers burning in the cold. The metal cut into his palm, but he kept working until the wire came loose. "Easy now," he whispered, voice low and steady. When he looked up, the storm had swallowed the path home. Wind screamed through the canyon, twisting their tracks into nothing. He could barely see the shape of Cinder ahead, the horse standing firm, head lowered into the wind, tail whipping like a flag. Eli looped the lead rope through his hand and shouted, "Find it, boy! Take us back!" Cinder stepped forward, slow and deliberate, nostrils flaring against the icy air. Eli followed, leading the mares behind. The horse broke the drifts with his chest, pushing through snow that rose past his knees. Each movement was labor, every breath a fight. The sleigh creaked behind them, weighted with the weakest mare. Hours passed in a blur of white and exhaustion. Eli's muscles screamed, his eyes stung from ice. But he kept his hand on the rope, trusting the animal that had once been left for dead. Somewhere ahead, the faint outline of the barn emerged. A shadow through the storm. The lantern May had hung on the post, flickering like a promise. They reached the yard just as the storm peaked. Eli unhitched the sleigh and guided the mares inside, one by one. When he turned back, Cinder was still standing in the snow, head bowed but steady, steam rising from his coat. The scarf around his neck was soaked, the red deepened to the color of wine. Eli walked to him and laid a hand against his side, feeling the tremor there. "You did it," he said softly. "You brought them home." Cinder exhaled hard, the sound deep and tired, then leaned his head against Eli's chest. For a moment, they stood there, unmoving, the storm raging around them, wind tearing through their silence. Inside the barn, the rescued mares nickered softly, the rhythm of life reclaiming its ground. By the time the storm passed, the yard was buried in snow up to the fence rails. May found Eli sitting on a bale of hay, brushing the frost from Cinder's mane. She crouched beside him, her hands trembling from cold and relief. "I saw you from the window," she said. "You looked like ghosts out there." "Maybe we were," Eli answered, eyes fixed on the horse. "But ghosts don't save the living." May reached for the scarf, wringing the water from it. "He's more than luck, Eli." "I know," he said quietly. "He's proof." Outside, the storm was dying, its voice fading into the far hills. The first light of dawn slipped across the horizon, thin and gold. Cinder's coat shimmered under it, steam curling from his back. For a moment, Eli thought he saw something like pride in the animal's stance, a quiet defiance against the world that had tried to erase him. Later, as May poured coffee at her kitchen table, she said, "Word'll spread fast. People talk when they see something worth talking about." "Let them talk," Eli replied, pouring oats into a bucket. "Let them see what survival looks like." When night fell, he hung the red scarf to dry beside the forge. Its color glowed in the firelight, warm and alive. He looked at Cinder, resting in the stall, and whispered, "You've earned your name 100 times over." The horse flicked an ear at the sound, eyes half closed. The barn was quiet except for the crackle of the dying fire and the soft breathing of tired animals. Eli stepped outside for air. The storm had left the world shining, every fence and field wrapped in silver light. He took off his hat, let the cold sting his face, and thought, maybe this is what grace feels like. Earned, not given. Behind him, Cinder gave a low, contented rumble, the kind of sound that fills a man's silence with meaning. Eli turned back toward the barn, smiling faintly. "We'll rest tonight, old boy," he said. "Tomorrow, the world will start watching." When the storm finally broke, the world lay clean and fragile, like a page that had been erased. The air smelled of pine and smoke, the kind that settles after something fierce has passed. Eli stood by the fence line, watching Cinder pick his way across the snow. The horse's gait was still slow, but steady now, sure-footed, as if the blizzard had burned weakness out of him. Word of what they had done drifted through town faster than the thaw. At the diner in Riverton, ranchers leaned on their stools and spoke in half-whispers. "That farrier from the basin brought back the whole herd in the middle of the blizzard," one said. Another replied, "The same horse that Brigg dumped? Thought it was dead." Even the waitress, pouring coffee with her hands wrapped in knit sleeves, shook her head. "Some folks just don't quit." By the second day, people began stopping by May's place. They didn't say much. Wyoming men weren't built for words, but they looked at the horse the way you look at something you don't quite understand. Cinder tolerated the attention. Eyes calm, tail flicking lazily. Eli kept working, fixing fence boards and resetting shoes, as if none of it mattered. But when a boy handed him an apple through the rails, he took it without a word and offered it to the horse. Cinder's breath puffed in the cold, soft as a sigh. May noticed the glances that followed Eli when he came into town for feed. Some were approving, others curious, and a few edged with envy. In a place where land and cattle meant worth, a man saving an old horse felt like a sermon that no one wanted to admit hit home. Still, they watched. People always watched. One afternoon, as Eli unloaded hay, the low rumble of a truck broke the quiet again. Kyle Briggs' black pickup rolled up, cleaner than before, shining like it didn't belong on dirt roads. He climbed out slowly, chewing on a toothpick, eyes hidden under the brim of his hat. "Looks like you've been busy," he said, surveying the yard. "Town's talking about you. Hero of the storm. That horse earn you a medal yet?" Eli didn't answer. He kept stacking bales until Briggs stepped closer. "Brand inspector's in town. Auction starts Saturday. I'll be there, with my paperwork." He spat into the snow, the sound sharp as gravel. "You had your fun. Time to hand over what's mine." Cinder, hearing the voice, shifted in his stall, ears flat. Eli turned toward the barn, the movement slow, deliberate. "You lost the right to him the day you left him in the ditch," he said. Briggs smirked. "The law don't run on feelings, cowboy. You think saving one half-dead horse makes you some kind of saint? You'll learn soon enough. Compassion doesn't pay the mortgage." Eli's eyes narrowed, but his tone stayed calm. "Neither does cruelty." Briggs' jaw twitched. He looked at the horse, then back at Eli. "See you Saturday." He climbed into the truck and peeled off, leaving deep tracks that marred the snow's clean surface. May appeared from the house, her shawl wrapped tight. "He's not letting go, is he?" "No," Eli said quietly. "But neither am I." That evening, as dusk settled, the basin filled with the smell of coal smoke and thawing earth. Eli sat outside the barn, his hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee. The forge inside glowed faintly, painting Cinder's silhouette in orange. Across the road, the lights of May's house burned soft. He could see her shadow moving behind the curtains, busying herself with small human things, baking, tending, living. It made the night feel less empty. Cinder shifted in his stall, nickering softly. Eli rose, set the mug down, and went to him. The horse's breath warmed his hand as he rubbed, along the jawline, feeling the pulse there. "We'll face them," he murmured. No papers in the world can tell us what we are. The barn was still except for that rhythm, the steady inhale and exhale of two creatures who had survived too much to bow easily. When the next morning came, the basin was alive with the noise of the thaw, dripping eaves, the faint rush of water beneath the snow. A few ranchers rode past, tipping their hats but not stopping. They had all heard about the claim. They were waiting to see how it ended. That night, Eli heard boots crunching outside. He opened the door to find May standing there, holding a pot covered with a cloth. "Stew," she said simply. "You'll need your strength." He smiled, tired but grateful. "You always bring something when words would do." "Maybe," she said, handing him the pot. "But food lasts longer." They ate quietly at the small workbench near the forge, the glow of the fire softening the lines on both their faces. After a while, May spoke again. "You know, when people stop talking, it doesn't always mean they stopped caring. Sometimes it means they're watching to see if what they heard was true." Eli glanced toward the stall. "Then let them watch." Later, after May left, Eli stepped outside. The stars were sharp, the kind that only appear after a storm. He looked toward the town lights flickering faintly in the distance and thought about what she'd said. The silent crowd wasn't the enemy. It was the mirror. People who wanted to believe that mercy could still win, even in a place where mercy wasn't profitable. He went back inside and hung his coat on a nail. Cinder lifted his head, eyes reflecting the glow of the forge. "They'll come for us soon," Eli said softly. "But we've faced worse." The horse exhaled, a sound that filled the quiet with something almost like resolve. Eli reached for the red scarf and tied it tighter around Cinder's neck. The fabric caught the light, bright against the dark, like a signal. In the morning, he would ride into town. Let the inspector, the papers, the law see what a living soul looked like when it chose to stand. But for now, the night was theirs, warm, still, and watched by 1,000 silent eyes. Saturday dawned sharp and clear, the kind of cold that burns clean through wool and bone. The town of Riverton woke under a pale sun, light bouncing off the wet roofs and frozen ruts of Main Street. Trucks crowded the gravel lot outside the livestock hall. Steam rose from exhaust pipes and coffee cups alike. It smelled of hay, diesel, and nerves. The brand inspection hearings always drew a crowd, part law, part spectacle, part reminder that a man's word could still be weighed against paper. Eli arrived just after 8, hat low, jacket dusted with frost. Beside him, Cinder stepped slow but steady, the red scarf bright against his neck. Conversations fell quiet as they passed. A few men nodded. Others looked away, uneasy at the sight of the horse that shouldn't have survived. Eli said nothing, guiding Cinder through the open doors of the auction hall. The wooden floor echoed under their steps. Kyle Brigg was already there, leaning against the railing, his paperwork neatly spread across the inspector's desk. He grinned when he saw them. "Morning, hero. Glad you brought my horse along. Saves me the trouble." Eli didn't respond. He led Cinder to the far wall, close to the lantern light. The horse lifted his head, nostrils flaring, catching the scent of too many strangers. The inspector, Coley Dunn, a man with gray hair and a permanent squint from years on open range, tapped the papers. "We'll start simple," he said. "Mr. Brigg claims legal ownership. Mr. Hart disputes on grounds of abandonment. Let's keep this civil." Briggs spoke first, his voice smooth, practiced. I bought that gelding 5 years back. Trained him myself. He went lame, couldn't keep up. Left him to rest near the creek. Figured he'd wander home once he was sound. Next thing I know, this farrier hauls him off and calls it mercy. Paperwork doesn't lie, Inspector. Eli's jaw tightened, but his tone was even. You left him in a ditch with rope burns on his legs. He wasn't resting. He was dying. Briggs smirked. You sure like painting yourself the savior? Maybe that horse just didn't know when to quit. Some animals don't. A murmur moved through the room. May sat near the back, her hands clasped tightly around her scarf. Dr. Pike leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Inspector Dunn looked up. Mr. Hart, you've got no bill of sale, no transfer of ownership. What makes this horse yours? Eli hesitated, then said quietly, He chose to live when no one else gave him the chance. That's more binding than any paper I've seen. Briggs laughed once, short and bitter. This isn't poetry, Cowboy. It's law. Dunn frowned, his gaze shifting from the paper to the horse. Sometimes law needs to see truth. He nodded toward Cinder. Bring him here. Eli walked the horse to the center of the hall. The boards creaked underfoot. The crowd leaned forward. Briggs stepped closer, snapping his fingers, voice sharp. Here, boy! Cinder flinched, head jerking back. The sound of the voice, that old authority, struck something deep in his memory. Briggs raised his hand slightly, an old habit, a command, maybe the ghost of a strike, and the horse's whole body went rigid. Eli stood still, heart hammering. He didn't move, didn't call, only brought his fingers to his lips and let out 2 low, clear notes of his whistle, the same sound that had once cut through the roar of a blizzard. Cinder's ears turned first. Then, step by slow step, he crossed the space between them, breath heavy in the cold air. The hall fell silent, except for the soft thud of hooves on the boards. When he reached, Eli, the horse, stopped, pressed his head against the farrier's chest, and exhaled, a sound long and low, like release. Nobody spoke. Even Briggs stood frozen, hand half raised, mouth open. Inspector Dunn cleared his throat, the sound breaking the spell. That's all I need to see. He scribbled on the form, signed, and tore off the bottom slip. Ownership transferred to Mr. Hart. This horse stays where it belongs. Briggs exploded. That's theft. You're siding with a story over the law. Dunn's voice was steady. The law says a man forfeits claim when he abandons responsibility. You didn't lose a horse, Mr. Briggs. You threw one away. Someone else picked up what you dropped. Laughter rippled faintly from the back, the kind that wasn't cruel but certain. Briggs' face reddened. He snatched up his papers, muttering curses under his breath, and stormed out. The heavy door slammed behind him, leaving a hollow echo in its wake. Eli didn't move. He kept a hand on Cinder's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath the skin. May stood slowly, eyes bright with quiet pride. Dr. Pike gave a nod that said more than words could. Dunn looked at the pair one last time. You ever notice, Hart, he said, some creatures aren't meant to be owned. They're meant to remind us what mercy looks like when it costs something. Eli gave a small nod. I know it now. He led Cinder out into the sunlight. The street was lined with faces, townsfolk who had come to watch from the windows and porches. They didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Some touched the brims of their hats as he passed. Children pointed at the red scarf and smiled. Eli paused at the hitching post, looking out toward the open road that led back to the basin. He could feel the eyes on him, not judging, just bearing witness. Cinder snorted softly, shaking off the morning's tension. The air smelled cleaner now, the kind that comes after truth is spoken. "Let's go home, boy," Eli said, swinging into the saddle. The horse turned, hooves striking sparks against the gravel as they started down the road. Behind them, the town returned to its business, the quiet kind of change that happens when people see something worth believing in. As they rode out past the edge of town, Eli glanced back once, watching the red scarf ripple in the wind. For the first time in years, the road ahead didn't look endless. It looked open. He touched the brim of his hat, and Cinder answered with a soft, rumbling breath that sounded like yes. Winter loosened its grip slowly, like an old man unclenching his fists. By late February, the snow along Wind River began to break apart, revealing mud and brittle grass beneath. The air carried that faint, metallic scent of thaw, a promise that the earth wasn't done yet. Eli stood outside the barn, hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the thin stream of meltwater carve its way through the pasture. It was quiet enough that he could hear Cinder chewing inside, the steady rhythm of a creature that had finally learned safety. The brand inspection hearing had faded into memory. The talk in town had already shifted to calves and crop prices, fuel costs and taxes, the endless cycle of things men used to measure worth. But every so often, when Eli drove in for supplies, someone would still nod and say, "That the horse from the storm?" And he'd answer simply, "Yes," without adding more. Some stories didn't need retelling. They just needed to be lived out in peace. Cinder had filled out through the winter. The ribs no longer showed, and his coat, brushed daily, gleamed like wet obsidian in the light. The red scarf, though frayed, still hung around his neck when Eli led him out to graze. It had become more than warmth. It was a marker of everything they'd survived, a symbol of being chosen and not abandoned. May came by often, sometimes with her daughter, sometimes alone. She brought pies that smelled of cinnamon and apples, her laughter faint, but genuine again. One evening, as the sun bled orange through the cottonwoods, she leaned against the fence beside Eli. "You ever think about leaving, now that he's yours for good?" she asked. Eli smiled slightly. "I've been leaving all my life. Maybe it's time to stay somewhere instead." She looked toward Cinder, grazing lazily in the pasture. "He changed you." Eli shook his head. "No. He reminded me I wasn't finished." The conversation drifted into a silence that wasn't awkward, but full. The kind that speaks in the space between breaths. The wind picked up and tugged gently at the scarf around Cinder's neck, making it flutter like a small red flame against the dimming sky. That night, the air was cold enough for frost to return, delicate and white along the barn's wooden edges. Eli couldn't sleep. He rose before dawn, the habit of years that never left him, and lit the forge. The sound of the hammer striking metal filled the stillness, a familiar music. Sparks flared and fell, tiny meteors against the dark. Inside the stall, Cinder stirred, ears twitching toward the sound that had once woken him from the edge of death. When the first light broke across the basin, Eli put the tools away and opened the barn door. The horizon glowed soft pink, clouds stretched thin like brushstrokes. He walked out into the field, the cold biting at his face. Cinder followed at his side without being led, each step easy now, his hooves sure against the half-frozen ground. At the fence line, Eli stopped. He untied the red scarf, running it through his hands. The wool was worn thin, the color faded in spots, but it was still bright enough to catch the light. He looped it over the top rail, letting it hang there. The wind caught it immediately, lifting it into a soft ripple. Against the white of the snow and the gray of the sky, it looked almost alive. He rested his arm on the fence and said quietly, "You're free now, Cinder. That was the deal, remember? You live, I let you go when you're ready." The horse turned his head, ears flicking toward Eli's voice, eyes calm. He didn't move away, didn't turn to run. He just breathed. Long and deep, the kind of breath that belongs to those who've found their peace. Eli smiled, the lines on his face easing. "Guess neither of us are going anywhere today." They stood there for a long time, the man and the horse, watching the sun climb higher over the fields. Every so often a bird would pass overhead, its shadow slipping across the snow. Somewhere far off, a train whistle blew, faint and mournful, fading into the hills. May and little June appeared at the edge of the path, waving as they came closer. The child's voice rang out bright in the crisp air. "Mama says the red scarf means he's special." Eli laughed softly. "He's just alive, that's all." But when June ran up and hugged Cinder's leg, the horse didn't shy. He bent his head slightly, the gesture slow and deliberate, almost tender. May smiled from where she stood, arms folded. "Alive special enough," she said. As the day warmed, Eli fixed a loose gate hinge, humming under his breath. Cinder grazed nearby, tail swishing lazily, content. The scarf fluttered on the fence, a small flash of color in a world just beginning to wake again. Later, when dusk returned, Eli sat on the porch steps, a cup of coffee steaming between his hands. Cinder stood by the gate, looking out toward the open plains. The air shimmered faintly with the smell of thawing earth and pine smoke. Eli raised his mug in a quiet toast. "To second chances," he said. The horse shifted his weight, as if in answer. The wind softened, carrying the faint sound of the scarf brushing wood. The sky turned deep blue, stars flickering through the last veil of cloud. And there, beneath that endless Wyoming sky, man and horse settled into the kind of peace that doesn't make noise. It just stays. When night finally swallowed the basin, Eli stood and walked to the barn. He touched the doorframe as he passed, the wood smooth from years of weather. "Come on, boy," he whispered. "Time to rest." Inside, the lamp's glow pooled across the straw, painting everything gold. The forge was cold, the anvil quiet, but the warmth remained. Cinder settled down, and Eli leaned against the post beside him. Neither spoke, but both understood. Tomorrow would come, like it always does. New work, new wind, another sunrise. But tonight belonged to the stillness they had earned. The red scarf danced softly in the breeze outside, catching moonlight, a quiet banner for those who believe that kindness, though small, can outlast the cold. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple 0 or 1 in the comments, so I'll know you stayed until the end. Tap, like if you believe kindness can still change the world, and subscribe to stay with me for the next story, because somewhere out there, another soul is still waiting to be seen.